Welcome to Getting to Know the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, or MDT. In this lesson, I'll start with installing MDT 2012 Update 1. We'll create a deployment share, create a Windows 8 image, and a task sequence to go along with that. I'll explain why it's so important to update your deployment share and what happens. Then we'll deploy Windows 8 to a bare metal machine, and I'll finish up with explaining the difference between a master versus a reference image. First, we need to install MDT and create a deployment share. MDT can be installed on any of these operating systems, from Windows 7 all the way up through Server 2012. I always recommend installing MDT on a server operating system. It just makes it easier down the line when you want to integrate MDT with other products, like Windows Deployment Services for Pixie Boot solutions. The installation process is pretty simple. There are only 3 steps. Step 1, install the Windows Assessment and Deployment Kit. Step 2, install MDT. And Step 3, create a deployment share, which will give you an MDT 2012 Update 1 deployment server. It's going to look like this. This is my 2012 server. It's called DeployServe, and it's going to be our MDT deployment server. We'll open the folder where I have already put all the software just to make things a little bit easier. I put it in the software folder, and the first thing we'll install is the ADK. Now, there are 2 ways to install the ADK. I'm going to go ahead and launch ADK Setup, but notice I also have the User Experience Manifest in the same folder, and I have my installers. Now, while this starts up, why is that so important? Because I have already downloaded from the internet everything I need to install the ADK. Otherwise, if you don't download first, you'll need to have internet access during installation. On the Specify Location page, I'm going to stick with the defaults and click Next. To join the Customer Experience Improvement Program, I'm going to choose No at this point. It's just a test or a lab environment, and click Next. We have to accept the license agreement and the features we want to install. So we don't need to install ACT, we don't need Vamped, Performance Toolkit, Windows Assessment Services, or SQL. If all you're doing is installing MDT, you simply need the deployment tools, the WinPE, and USMT. Once you've selected those, click Install and let it rip. When the installation completes, you'll automatically be bumped up to the Welcome to the Assessment and Deployment Kit page. We're not going to launch the Getting Started guide. I'll let you guys do that on your own. So I'll leave that box unchecked for now and simply click Close. Next, we'll back up one folder, go to the MDT folder, and we'll install MDT. We'll choose Yes on the Open File Security Warning. The first page is the Welcome to the MDT 2012 Update 1 Setup Wizard. Click Next. Accept the license agreement. Click Next. And again, I like to stick with the defaults. I find it's just easier when troubleshooting issues to have installed everything into the default folders. If you want to change it, you can always browse to a different folder. Also, you can check out, well, how much hard drive space do I actually need? It tells you the size of your drives, how much space is available, and then how much would be required. We'll get back to our installation, click Next, and the Customer Experience Improvement Program, I'm not going to join at this time, so Next, and then Install to kick it off. And this really is a pretty quick installation. When completed, click Finish. We can close this page down, and it's time to open MDT's tool, the Deployment Workbench. So we'll go to our desktop, and here's our Deployment Workbench. To begin with, notice that we have 2 nodes, the Information Center and deployment shares. If we just kind of cruise through the Information Center, there's all kinds of information on how to get started. What should you do first? There's really good documentation. Strange place to put it, but they also have the documentation for zero-touch installations using Config Manager, both versions 2007 and the latest and greatest 2012. We can also check on the components that we currently have installed and what other components are available for download. Where we're going to do all of our work is in the actual deployment shares node itself. And notice when I highlight it, there are no deployment shares. So by default, of course there are no deployment shares. We have to create our deployment share. So I'll right-click Deployment Shares, choose New Deployment Share, and this is one time I'm not going to take the default. I am going to put this on the E drive and click Next. We'll accept the default share name of deployment share $, and knowing the $sign is an administrative share. Click Next. The description, let's stick with MDT deployment share. And again, I'm going to accept the defaults, but I want you to know that whatever you choose on this page simply affects the questions that are asked when you perform a deployment. And these are a piece of cake to change later on. I'm going to show you how to go in and edit these. But just so you're well informed, the first one is ask if a computer backup should be performed. So while you're doing a deployment, if you're deploying to a machine that already has an operating system on it, this will prompt you to back it up before the deployment begins. Second one, ask for a product key. The third, ask to set the local administrator password. Most of the time, we're going to handle this at a much higher level. The last two, ask if an image should be captured. I like to leave that one enabled. And ask if BitLocker should be enabled. We can always say no to any of these during deployment. This simply gives you the option of getting the question asked. So I'll take the default settings and click Next. Next one more time. And we are done. Click Finish. And I'm going to close up that Information Center and expand our brand new deployment share. These are the nodes we'll be working with: the application node, operating systems, out-of-box drivers, packages, task sequences, advanced configuration that comes up a little later in another lesson, and monitoring, that's in a lesson all of its own as well. So for now, we've installed the Windows ADK and MDT. We've also created our very first deployment share. Next, we need to add some MDT components and create a task sequence. First, we'll add an operating system. These are the supported operating systems that we can add to MDT. We can add additional components like applications and MSIs, EXEs, CMDs, or BAT files. So you create that package files together or run custom command lines. Pretty much anything you could put in a CMD or BAT file can be deployed using MDT. The packages node, well, that's just for operating system patches and language packs. Then drivers, those are our out-of-box drivers that we'll be adding. Over time, you'll probably have multiple images. You'd have one image for Windows 7 machines, another for Windows 8, maybe another for Windows 8 mobile devices, and then yet another one for your Server 2012 OSs. You'll have different drivers for different models of machines, applications for different groups of users. So you're going to need some way during a deployment to group your components together for a specific type of deployment. And that is called a task sequence. Task sequences, they help you keep a single image for deployment. If the only thing you're doing is Windows 8 deployments, you can have a task sequence that has one image, one Windows 8 image, yet you deploy all the marketing apps in one task sequence. In a second task sequence, you could deploy that same Windows 8 image, but a different set of applications. So the nice part of that is there are a lot of organizations out there that want to maintain a single image and deploy it differently. Task sequences allow you to do that. Before you can actually deploy anything, we have to update the deployment share. So far, all we've done is create the deployment share. But updating the deployment share will create the MDT WinPE that we'll need to boot our clients with. It also adds drivers to the WinPE, and you can customize that WinPE. You can change the colors, you can change the picture, the background. You can do lots of different customizations to your WinPE. Back to our deployment server. We left the deployment workbench open. It's ready to go. So the first thing I'm going to add is an operating system. I like to set up folders so I can keep things just a little bit nice and neat. This will be a Win8 folder. And I'll expand operating systems. On Win8, we can right-click and choose to import an operating system. Now we can choose a full set of source files and point to the root of a Windows 8 DVD or a folder where I've copied the entire DVD to, which is what we're going to do. Once we have custom WIM images, we could add a custom image file. And if you had a Windows Deployment Service or WDS server set up that already has images in it, you can point to that WDS server, and then on the next page, you can tell it the name of the server, and you will import all operating system images from that server. You can't pick and choose the ones you want. You either get everything or you get nothing. Like I said, we're sticking with full set of source files and clicking Next. It wants to know where are those source files. So I will browse to the folder on the E drive, Software, Win8 OS, and because I have copied the DVD to a folder on the same partition as I have MDT installed on, we get the option to move the files. Now, if you're pointing to a root of a DVD, of course you can't move the files, so that option would be grayed out. But this makes it a lot faster. We're done. The destination directory name, I'm going to shorten that up just a bit. We'll call it Win8 int x86 and click Next. Next on the summary and finish. We now have our first Windows 8 operating system imported. The next step is let's add some drivers. Now, drivers, it's really important to set up a folder scenario. I'm going to create a Lenovo folder. And then you probably want to break yours down even by model. That would keep it a lot cleaner for you, and it makes things easier later on. I only have one folder that I'm going to add, so I'm just going to leave it at just Lenovo. Then I can import the drivers, and the only thing we have to specify is where we put the drivers. So we'll go back to that E drive, Software folder, and I have drivers in the Drivers folder. What a big surprise. Notice that we also have the option to import drivers even if they are duplicates of an existing driver. When we get to the advanced features like selection profiles, you'll see that there are reasons why we want to have the same driver in multiple folders. So for now, I'm going to leave that alone. We don't have anything imported anyway, so it wouldn't make any difference for us. But when we get to selection profiles, I will come back to this. We'll click Next. Next again. Let those guys get imported. Now, just like the older versions of MDT, and I haven't shown this before because it's not new, you could save the output to a text file. You could also view the PowerShell script that ran to import those drivers. The nice thing about this is you can copy and paste this script into a PS1 file and actually create a file that could be your disaster recovery. So while you're setting up, creating your deployment share, adding your OS, adding your drivers, you could be creating that DR PS1. I'm going to close that down for now, and we'll click Finish on the confirmation page of importing our drivers. Now that the drivers are imported, you can see them all listed in the Lenovo folder. You could even go further and break these down as to audio drivers, modem drivers, video drivers, however you'd like to set up your environment. For us, the next step is to add an application. I like to split my applications up into folders as well. Step 1 then would be right-click and choose New Folder. And the folder name I'm going to give it are going to be Typical Applications. These are applications that will be deployed to everyone. Then I can go down to my folder, right-click, and choose New Application. 3 different types of applications can be added. An application with source files, which is what we're going to do. The next screen would then ask, where are the source files? We point to that folder, and they will be imported into the MDT's deployment share, which we're going to take a look at in just a few minutes. There's also an application without source files, or it's elsewhere on the network. So, application without source files, that's pretty self-explanatory. If it's elsewhere on the network, that means you're going to have to point to the UNC of the server and shared folder where the application resides. The last one, well, that's an application bundle. And the application bundle allows you really to create a container. That's what the bundle is. And then, after you've added all your applications, you can open that bundle and input the applications so you could then set up dependencies in the order in which you want your applications installed. We're sticking with application with source files and clicking Next. Publisher. Ours is going to be Microsoft. Application name is Office. The version will be 2013. And I think we should just stick with English for this lab and click Next. The source directory, we can browse to the folder where I've copied that. And yes, by now you guys know what folder I'm going to. Software, Office 2013, but I downloaded the 2013 that has both x86 and x64 source files. For this, because we already added the Windows 8 32-bit OS, I'm going to choose the 32-bit Office as well, and click OK. Again, I'd rather move them because it's a lot faster, and they are copied onto the same partition that MDT is. We'll click Next. And it concatenates what we typed in previously, Microsoft Office 2013. The only thing that's left out is that we're doing it in English to create the name of the directory that will be created. I'm going to leave that there and click Next. The command line, we'll just do setup.exe, and I'll come back to that working directory a little later. Click Next, Next again. And when the process completes, finish. We've now added Microsoft Office 2013. The next step is to add a task sequence. And again, I like to start with folders. So this folder, I'm going to be deploying that Windows 8, and let's just make sure we remember that it's 32-bit. Create that folder. Then I will right-click and choose New Task Sequence. The task sequence ID, I'm going to stick with Win8, x86, and here we can be a little bit more explanatory. Let's do Windows 8 Enterprise, 32-bit. And for comments, guys, this is a great time for you to document what is going to be in this task sequence. And you can always come back and add to this later, but it really helps if you know when this task sequence runs, what applications are supposed to be deployed, what drivers are supposed to be deployed, which packages are supposed to be deployed. It kind of helps to remember that, or at least put in the date maybe, and the reason you created the task sequence. Maybe you were testing it for some reason, but the comments will really help you. You're going to end up with a lot of task sequences normally. So the comments really do help a lot. Of course, I'm going to leave them blank for now and click Next. On the Select Template page, we have some built-in templates that Microsoft has already created for us. And the first one there is sysprep and capture. If we wanted to create a template that the only thing it did is sysprep an existing machine, shut it down, boot it to a WinPE, and then capture an image, that's the task sequence we would choose. I'm going to skip over the one we're going to use. I'll come back to that in a second. The standard client replace task sequence. The replace scenario, if you remember from earlier, is about having one machine that you gather all the user's data and settings from, putting those on a server somewhere, throwing that machine away, return it to the vendor you've leased it from, and then you're going to bring in a new machine, put a new OS on it, and then pull those users' data and settings back down to that machine. This is the task sequence for you. A custom task sequence is pretty much empty. There's only one entry there, and you have to build the entire task sequence. And you'll see when we're done with this and come back and look at the properties later on why you might not want to do that. We have a light touch OEM task sequence, a standard server task sequence, a post OS installation task sequence. The post OS could be maybe running a BAT file that you've created, possibly installing an application. And the last two have to do with VHD. Up to this point, everything we've been doing are WIM images, or talking about templates that deal with WIM images. VHD images are deploy to a VHD client or deploy to a VHD server. So what's nice about this version is they've rolled these into the actual deployment workbench itself. So if you'd like to use the virtual hard disk images instead of the Windows image images, it's a lot easier now. Let's pop back up and do our standard client task sequence. Click Next. And we have to choose the operating system. We only have one at this point, so that's the one we're going to use. And do we want to specify a product key? I'm not going to specify a product key at this time. If you wanted to, you could do a MAC key in the middle. Or if you're deploying XP or Windows Server 2003, you could input the product key on the third selection. Choosing Do Not Specify, and we get to the OS settings. The full name. We'll just input our name. The organization is Globomantics Inc. And the home page is going to be www.globomantics.com. These will be our default settings for this deployment. Click Next. Specify the local administrator password. You're going to see this password later on. It's my safe, secure password with a capital P. Or you can choose Do Not Specify an administrator password at this time. Click Next, Next, and it's really quick. Task sequence is done. When it's completed, click the Finish button, and we now have a task sequence created. Before we get into updating the deployment share, I'd like to show you what's been created. I'll go into Windows Explorer, my eVolume, and this is my deployment share. These are the folders that house everything needed for an MDT deployment. If we look in that Applications folder, we'll see Microsoft Office 2013. Remember the name, how it got there? We okayed that. So there's our 2013. Back up again. I want to show you for operating systems. There's our Windows 8 Int x86. And the out-of-box drivers. These are our list of out-of-box drivers. Now, probably the most important reason why I brought you in here is I wanted to show you that the boot folder contains absolutely nothing. And you'll see after we update our deployment share, we will have a new ISO and WIM. In fact, we'll have two, a 32-bit and a 64, in this folder. So I'm going to close this guy down. We'll go back to our deployment share. When I tell it to update the deployment share, that's when it generates those MDT WinPEs. You have a couple of options. We can optimize the boot image updating process or choose to completely regenerate the boot images. Well, we haven't done anything yet, so it really doesn't matter which one you choose, because if we choose to regenerate, it's going to generate for the first time our boot images. So this really comes in later when you need to update your deployment share again. When you add additional drivers like network drivers, or mass storage drivers, or possibly video drivers, and you want those guys injected into your MDT WinPE. When that happens, you import your drivers into the out-of-box drivers folder like we did earlier, and then update the deployment share. We'll talk a little bit later on in a different lesson about the properties of our deployment share and what else we can do. For now, we're just going to choose either option, it doesn't matter, and click Next. We'll click Next again. And you'll see that this takes longer and longer depending on how much work you give it to do. So what's actually happening here is it's looking at your WinPE and it's determining if any changes need to be made. Well, we don't have one yet, so it's actually going to the template of the folder where we installed MDT. It's grabbing that template, generating a WinPE for us, actually two I mentioned before. This can take quite a while sometimes, so I always recommend start the update process, then go grab a cup of coffee or go to lunch. Once the deployment share has been updated, on the confirmation page, click Finish. And I'll show you what we now have. Back to Windows Explorer, eDrive, Deployment Share. In that boot folder, now we've got some WinPEs. And what you have WinPEs for 32 and 64. These would be your ISOs. That guy's an ISO file. This guy's an ISO. You also have WIMs in case you'd like to integrate WDS, which we'll talk about when we get to the WDS lessons. And you also have the XML documents that describe how to create the WinPEs. And while we're out here, let's go ahead and look at the rest of the folders that I didn't show you earlier. We've got OEM, that's a special folder if you're deploying XP or Server 2003. That guy comes in handy. We have the backup folder. Remember when we created the deployment share, there was a setting to ask if it should create a backup first. If it does create a backup, this is the default location where the backup would go. What is the backup? The backup is a WIM image, of course. We've seen the boot folder. Captures folder, empty, but if we tell it to capture an image of an existing machine, then this is the default where it's going to store that. Of course, you can change that and put it anywhere you choose, but that is the default setting. In the control, this is where we have our task sequence and everything that's tied into the task sequence. This is our Win8x86 task sequence, and we're going to come back to that later on. Operating systems and drivers we saw. Packages would have operating system patches, office patches, and language packs. The scripts folder is a pretty important folder. This contains all the scripts that are used by MDT to do everything. The great thing about MDT is there's a lot of VB scripts in here that are fully editable, and the MDT team did a really good job documenting what the script is supposed to do. So when you open a script, just read that top paragraph and you'll know immediately what the script was meant to do. We have the servicing folder for DISM and some of the other deployment tools. When we need to mount WinPEs, inject drivers into those are actually servicing those WinPEs. We have our templates folder, which when we get into the GPO packs, we'll come back to. I don't want to spend too much time on that now because it's a fairly large topic. The tools folder contains all the tools that MDT actually uses, and there's different versions of each tool. There's 64 and 32-bit. And that's what makes up your whole deployment share. The deployment share is nothing fancy. It's folders with data and scripts in them. So if you want to back up your deployment share, copy the deployment share folder to a USB stick and you have a backup. You can even take that to another machine that has MDT installed and open that deployment share. Let me show you what it looks like to open a deployment share. Of course, you can't open one that's already open, so the first thing I need to do is close this guy. And then if I right-click on Deployment Shares, choose Open, browse to where that deployment share is. You could be going to a USB stick. It really doesn't matter. And if you had created the deployment share in an older version of MDT, the first time you open it in the newest version, you'll have to upgrade the contents of the deployment share. And there we've opened our deployment share again. So up to this point, we have added Windows 8 as our operating system, some Lenovo drivers, Windows Office 2013 as our application, and we've created a task sequence. Next, we'll create a reference image. To create a reference image, we're going to start with some of the same steps we've already done. We have our Windows 8 DVD, and we have an MDT 2012 Update 1 deployment server with a deployment share already created. Step 1 is to add Windows 8 as an operating system. Throw in any applications, drivers, patches, language packs that you'd like to import to the MDT deployment server. Then we'll deploy that to a target machine. Sysprep that machine using generalized and UBI out-of-box experience switches. Very important that you use those two switches. And create an image, storing it on the MDT server. Now, the master image. To create the master, you would deploy the reference image, create a WIM out of that, and that WIM becomes the master image. The big difference between a reference and a master image is the reference image in a task sequence would usually list every single application that's going to be deployed. And there are going to be a large number, from what I've seen in most environments, a large number of applications that every single machine gets. So in order to keep it manageable, the reference image task sequence would list each individual application that's being deployed. Then you would create a master image of a machine that has all the applications inside that WIM file. Why not just deploy that reference image? Well, if you have to go in and look at the task sequence, you'll know that there are maybe 25, 30 applications that are being deployed to the reference image. In the master image, the only thing that's happening is the WIM image that has the applications in it is being laid down. So, reasons to not deploy the reference image? Time. I've been in environments where it took over 3 hours to deploy that reference image because you're having to lay down the OS and then tack all the applications on top of it. But as soon as we deployed the reference image, sysprepped the machine, captured the image, and then deployed the master image, we got it down to 20 to 25 minutes instead of 3.5 hours per deployment. So I think time is the best reason as to why you should deploy the master image. In that reference image, if you would like to make a change, something simple like a different version of an application has come out, Adobe Reader or Silverlight or Flash, just name it, whatever the application is. It's so easy to open that reference image task sequence, go to the actual task that deploys that application, and simply browse to the new application. You don't have to create a new task sequence. You can just easily swap out new applications. Now, yes, you will have to create a new master image doing it this way, but you really should only be doing that 3, maybe 4 times a year. Now, it's time to deploy that master image using MDT's network deployment. What we have here is our MDT deployment server and that MDT WinPE from the deployment share boot folder. Step 1 is to put that on some type of medium so that we can get it to our machines to boot that WinPE. Your options, CD or a bootable USB. We're going to go with a bootable USB. So boot your target machine where we want to put the image using the MDT WinPE. Then the target machine can connect to MDT and download an image. So let's go create that reference image. So back to the deployment server. We've got Deployment Workbench set up. We've already checked our boot folder, and we have our MDT WinPEs. Let me show you what I've done with that. We'll minimize, and you can see my host desktop. This is our Light Touch PE 32-bit ISO. So I've copied it to the desktop, and then I've created a bare metal MDT client machine. Two things I've done is I've set it up for the CD to point to my desktop, and there's the light touch PEI, so it's going to boot. And I also put it on the same subnet as my servers because this is a network deployment, therefore it requires network connectivity. We'll power on this VM. And this is the MDT WinPE that automatically launches the deployment wizard for us. What we can do on this page is run the deployment wizard. We can run the Windows recovery wizard. You can exit to a command prompt, but of course that's going to kill the deployment. If you want a command prompt at this point, maybe you're not sure if you have an IP address from DHCP. You can hit the F8 key and you'll get your command prompt. Then you could simply do an ipconfig and confirm that you do have a valid IP address. This is also a great way to go check log files on machines that are having problems with the deployment. But don't leave this window open. Leaving this window open will prevent the client machine from rebooting and actually performing the deployment. So always make sure you close down your command prompts. The keyboard layout will stick with US. And if you don't have DHCP set up for your clients to get an IP address from, you can always configure them with a static IP address. You can input your IP, subnet mask, default gateway, DNS servers and suffixes, and your Win servers. I'm going to stick with DHCP because everything looked good already. And choose to run the deployment wizard. We need to give it credentials to connect to our network share. The username will be administrator, password, and the domain name is Globomantics Inc. On the task sequence page, choose the one and only task sequence you have at this point and click Next. The name of the computer, well, let's make it something a little bit better than the default they give it, the mini-nt, and then just a bunch of characters that don't really mean anything. So this is going to be a marketing machine, and it will belong to one of the VPs there. We can set it up to join a domain, tell it the domain name. In the organizational unit box, you can input the OU where you'd like the computer object to be created in Active Directory. You do have to input the distinguished name. The username, password, and domain are already filled in for you. A couple things you should know about creating the reference image. Number one, I never, ever join it to a domain because then you get the domain SID and things get a little bit messy. You have to go in and use tools every time you deploy it. So I always join the machine to a work group if I'm going to generate an image that I want to deploy to other machines. The second thing you should know is I don't do this to a physical machine. There's no reason to deploy to a physical machine. It's much easier and faster to deploy to a virtual machine. You don't have to deal with a lot of driver issues, and it's just going to be a lot easier and faster for you. So join the machine to a work group to create the reference image, and always do it on a VM. We're set. Clicking Next. And then, do we want to move data and settings from a previous version of Windows? Well, this is a bare metal machine, so there's nothing on it. Notice, I like the little green box we have. A supported previous version of Windows was not found on this computer. There are no data and settings, so we're going to leave it at the Do Not Move User Data and Settings and click Next. It is possible, especially if you were performing a replace scenario, that we previously put users' data and settings on a server somewhere. So this screen is asking, do we want to restore the user data? And if we do, we would tell it to specify a location, input the server name, shared folder name, where we stored this specific user's data. We're going to leave it set to Do Not Restore User Data and Settings and click Next. For the locale and time, we're going to stick with English, and I'll go down to Eastern Time. and click Next. If you'd like to install applications, this is where you can choose to install that application. And do we want to capture an image of this reference computer? Well, yes, that's the point of the reference machine. So I'm going to tell it to capture an image of the reference computer. And notice the location is already filled in for us. The name of our server is deploy_serve. It knows it will be in the deployment share $ shared folder. And by default, it puts it in the captures folder. And as I said earlier, you can put this any place you want it, but it's just nice to have a default location. The file name is going to be win8x86.wim. You can change that too if you like. Your other options are sysprep this computer, but it won't capture an image. You can prepare to capture the machine, which will copy any needed sysprep files to the right location, but it doesn't do anything else. Or you could choose do not capture an image of this computer, which is what you will select when we are deploying the master image. I'm going to leave it set to capture an image of this machine at the defaults and click Begin. One of the nice things with the installation progress is it shows you everything that's happening as it's happening. So I really like that you can see the action that's currently running and which step of the action that's running. So right now we're formatting and partitioning the disks. When the deployment has completed and your new image has been captured, you will get the success screen. If there were any errors on this screen, you'd be able to click on the details, and different errors would give you different colors of the screen. The happy screen you want to see is the blue and white, not the lemon yellow or the salmon red. And on those, if there were errors, you can click on the details and the error messages would show up there for you. As you can see, we have no errors, no warnings, everything's good. So we can click Finish and go check out what we have over on our server. On the MDT server, we'll minimize the deployment workbench, go into Windows Explorer, go to the E drive, deployment share, and in the captures folder is our brand new WIM image. How easy is that? We can also go back to our MDT client and see it is booting up and everything's good. And here we have the brand new Windows 8 machine. And of course now, since we sysprepped this machine, we have to go through the sysprep mini setup wizard. Which takes us back to our PowerPoint. That new WIM image can now be imported as a custom WIM image operating system. And we can deploy it through a task sequence just like we've set up for the original Windows 8. When that's done, you can perform your master deployment of that image through the network deployment, just like we previously did. Well, from installing MDT to deploying Windows 8 to a bare metal machine and creating your first image, we did it all in this lesson. Thanks for watching.